and I believe also a big crowd online. And this kind of an event with superstar guests like George and Amy, this is exactly what Lee and I envisioned when we cooked up this new concept. And we're very grateful to both George Church and Amy Harmon for coming, and we're also very grateful to the Kavli Foundation for making this possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Robert Lee Holtz, science writer at the Wall Street Journal and a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute, as well as our very capable moderator of the Kavli Conversations. It's all yours, Lee.
Thank you, Professor Fagan. So, welcome, as Dan says, to the Kavli Conversations on Science Communication. Our goal here this evening is to look at not science journalism, not at cutting-edge research, but at both as refracted through the lens of the efforts of both science journalists and science communicators to reach out and grab the public and get them thinking seriously about these issues. This is the third in our series of these conversations. It's sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and by the NYU Science, Health, Environment Reporting Program, of which Dan Fagan is director. I want to just say that we have two more this spring. On April 20th, we'll be joined by Andrea McDaniels, an award-winning reporter from the Baltimore Sun, and NIH brainiac, Douglas Fields, author of a new book called Rage, and we'll be looking at the seeds of inner-city violence from these two perspectives. And then on May 4th, we'll be joined by Ann Gibbons, the correspondent for Science Magazine, and the American Museum's Ian Tattersall, a distinguished paleoanthropologist and author, to look at the touchy subject of human origins. These will all be webcast nationally or internationally, as will this session this evening. So, as we are live from New York, I encourage the tangible human beings, you three-dimensional entities in front of me, to, when you're comfortable with the conversation, chime in with your questions through the mic over there. And also, all of you who are watching us online, please tweet us your questions using the hashtag Kavli Convo. Kavli Convo. Now, our topic tonight: synthetic life, bioengineered food, gene therapy, bacterial biofuels, regenerative medicine, eugenics, CRISPR-Cas9, the connectome, life as we are coming to know it anew. News and narratives from the frontier of life sciences. It's exotic and contested terrain in which journalists and scientists angle for advantage, simultaneously allies and adversaries. So we're particularly fortunate this evening to be joined by two of the country's most preeminent communicators on genetics, George Church of Harvard and Amy Harmon of the New York Times. Now, George, as many of you may know, is a geneticist, a molecular engineer, a chemist of considerable renown. He is a professor of genetics at the Harvard Medical School and professor of health science and technology at Harvard and MIT. He's one of the founders of the Weiss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. And for our purposes, though, it's not so important that he was one of the architects of the Human Genome Project. It's not even so important that he's one of the co-inventors of CRISPR-Cas9, which is a gene editing technology which is in the process of revolutionizing, yet again, our ability to manipulate the human genome. No, for our purposes, what's important is that he is also a frequent commentator on genome issues. He's an essayist who frequently airs his thoughts through The Edge. He's a frequent guest for Stephen Colbert, and an author, most recently of Regenesis, which is a book in which he kind of reviews the promise in the history of synthetic biology. And it goes to the heart of what we're going to be talking about this evening if I tell you that this book has had a remarkable and unusual press run. At last count, I think it's been run out at 70 billion copies because George transcribed the text of this book into a DNA sequence, which he then had copied in his laboratory as a demonstration project in DNA digital archiving. Amy Harmon, no slouch, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for the New York Times, where she's worked since 1997. She is one of the most, I think, remarkable and unique talents in science journalism in the United States today. She has cornered the market on the long-form science narrative, in which she has, in a series of prize-winning stories over the last several years, done thoughtful and provocative and attention-getting takeouts on the emotional life of autism, on human brain connectomics, on cancer drug testing, clinical trials, on various aspects of advanced biology. Most recently, you may have seen her front page story several days ago on the effort to sequence the genome of the Zika carrying mosquito, which was distinguished. Of course, we never pay attention to the words, but we look at the play of the huge art, which maybe is the most prominent picture of a DNA blot in American publishing. But what they have in common here this evening is that they each are what I kind of think of as stunt flyers. They each, in their own way, have conceived projects, demonstrations, long-form narratives that each artfully and in some exotic ways bring the public directly into the issues and the potentials and perhaps even the perils of the kinds of biological advances that we're talking about. What do I mean? Well, I mentioned the sequencing the book. George also is the architect of the Personal Genome Project, in which is still running. I don't know how many are up now, several thousand? How many?
Yeah, there's thousands in 5 countries.
Yeah,
now.
Thousands of people have posted their genetic sequences publicly. And while this has considerable scientific interest, I suspect that George's initial impulse was to find a way to prompt a public conversation about genetic privacy. Amy, in her way, through the selection of her story topics for her narrative journalistic pieces for the New York Times, has artfully constructed a series of covert arguments of pro and con about the upsides and downsides of various technologies. And so they actually have a lot more in common than you would think on the surface, and that's the subject of our conversation this evening, which is what can these two people, from each of their own perspectives on the side of the fence of science, or what C.P. Snow used to call the Great Gulf, and our friend over here in the liberal arts, they have something they can reveal to us. And I want to start by asking you both, so who do you think the public is in this conversation? Who's your audience?
Well, so we have a few audience. Part of my time I'm talking to peers, experts, but what I like to talk to with the book and working with journalists is everybody. I think an increasing number of the decisions we make, whether political or business, involve some level of science and technology, and really everybody needs to become much more, there needs to be a dialogue both ways. There's ignorance on the scientist side and as well as on the public, which means every person, 7.5 billion people.
So you cast your net widely.
Yeah.
Amy, we ask you the same question. So who, your readers, is that your public, just your readers? Is there a larger public? What are you reaching out for?
I when I'm writing my stories, in general, like, until very recently, I always had my father in mind. I don't know what that, but so my father is he's a lawyer, but with eclectic interests. He's not a science geek. He cares about science. He cares about society. He cares about, sort of human values. But he's sort of like your typical front page reader of the New York Times. Now, I think about my daughter, who's 11, who often edits my stories over my shoulder, and so I also am trying to aim for her demographic.
Okay, so he's thinking about 7.8 billion people, and you're thinking about 2.
Yeah,
Okay.
but they're representative.
They're representative.
Of the billions.
Of the billions.
Yes.
All right. So, again, I want to ask a pair question here. So now, you are, sir, a working scientist. You are running several large laboratories. When you step out of the laboratory to function as, well, I guess what we could call a public intellectual or a provocateur of science, I mean, is there a risk that you run as a scientist? I mean, does this then call you into some disrepute among your peers? What they used to call the Carl Sagan problem. The more you stick your head up above the crowd, the more the peer committee hurls things at you.
Yeah. I think there is a perceived risk. Doesn't mean that there's a real one. And in fact, a lot of the projects that we take on are perceived as being impossible technically, but generally they're actually a lot easier than the ones that we passed over. But there's a question about choosing that. Certainly it helps to have a very high ratio of stuff that publications that appeal to the experts, and then they'll give you a break if you take a little time off to consult with the other 7.5 billion people, the ones that they don't communicate with for their own reasons. And so that's what I try to do. I mean, we have a very active laboratory, and that's why I can get away with occasional flights of fancy or saying what dangers lie ahead or what safety measures we might want to have, which can be career enders if you don't have a good balance.
I will say that George is known among journalists as he will respond to your email, which is like a really good thing. I mean, it is sort of a rare thing. Like, he will respond with it. I shouldn't say it in a room full of like.
Yeah, no. I mean,
okay, I've got to change my email and phone now. Yeah.
But I mean, I do. I will say it's sort of a rare thing that he makes it a priority. I mean, but maybe it comes with that double edge that you're sort of suggesting of like, is he too reachable? Is he too? I mean, I don't feel that way, but I think there is that sort of the Carl Sagan that idea that like.
There are people out there who work. I don't know exactly what to call it, so I'm going to call it sort of the theatrics of genetics. We just had a good example of it the other day when Craig Ventnor and his colleagues announced that they had created a cell with the smallest number of genes for that particular species of bacteria required for life. Now, on the one hand, it may have some utility in the long run, but certainly in the short run, it's an attention-getting device. And you, sir, have got a great track record of coming up with a lot of very well-crafted and entertaining attention-getting devices. The DNA sequence of your book, the origins of the personal genome project. I mean, this was an effort that started with just 10 volunteers, but the 10 volunteers consisted of sort of intellectual celebrities like Steven Pinker, who, of course, then would attract people like you and me like flies to the peach. So when you're doing this, I guess I'm wondering, and I'm not letting you off the hook, I'm going to get to you in a minute. What I'm wondering is your motivation here. Partly, is it you just have this altruistic view, you want to educate the public about the ethics of things that are on the horizon ahead of them? Is this lobbying? I mean, are you helping to create an appetite for the research that you'd like to see funded? You are, of course, a founder and entrepreneurial spirit who you're on the advisory board or have been involved with like, geez, 20 companies? I've lost track. So is this also advertising? Are you creating a market for it? I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, so, I think relatively few of our projects, even though they might be photogenic or, the writing equivalent, that's not really how they were designed. They were designed to be some kind of pure science philosophical component. Some, most important to me, technological component where we move the dial by at least factors of 10, and then some societal component, all mixed up.
Can you give me an example?
Well, for example, next generation sequencing is something where you can ask fundamental questions about anything ranging from ancient DNA to multiple life forms, and it has a technologically moved it by 3 million fold. So that's that meets.
For my father and daughter, can you explain what next generation sequencing is?
Well, it's just let's just call it determining the sequence of your genes, which are made up of A, C's, G's, and T's. And that used to cost $3 billion to get your genome sequenced. And that was completely unacceptable to me, even from when we proposed to do it and didn't know how to. And so we and others that I've worked with have been bringing it down to now $1,000. And it's going to continue to drop. So that's something that it's not a stunt. This actually has some potential ramifications that are useful. The same thing when we build a synthetic organism, we're not building one that's not connected to industry. We're using the one that's smack in the middle of industry, which is E. coli.
Right.
So our synthetic organism is chosen to be industrially useful.
Okay.
It may also get attention, but that's not the only reason.
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe I didn't ask my question right. So certainly wouldn't be the first time. I'm thinking of the base technologies that you've outlined, of course, have major and clear-cut engineering and sequencing importance. Their scientific accomplishments and endeavors. But when you choose to talk to them about, talk to us about them, typically, like that's not what you bring up. What you do is you talk about reanimating the ancient DNA of the woolly mammoth.
Right.
That gets our attention.
That's true.
That's what I'm asking you about.
Okay.
What's going on in that fertile brain of yours when you're doing that?
Well, part of this is an ascertainment bias, where I put a bunch of stuff out there, and you pick one of them, okay? And what maybe distinguishes me in Amy's mind is I'm willing to go with that, okay? Well, a lot of my colleagues would say, wait a minute, no, that's not my department. I'm not going to talk to you about mammoths. I'm not going to talk to you about the extinction.
So why do it?
Well, with mammoth, actually, the way we got into it is a journalist was following the story on sequencing the mammoth, which we had nothing to do with other than providing the technology, and was
we had nothing to do with it except making it possible.
We didn't actually touch the mammoth.
No,
okay,
I know.
We were not up to our armpits in mammoth carcass. But he didn't feel that the story of sequencing the mammoth was enough. And he wanted more. And so he said, well, there must be somebody out there who can synthesize a mammoth, right? And so I don't know how many people he asked before he got to me. And I said, well, that's an interesting idea. And I gave him an answer, and he wanted a little more. And then it got published.
Right.
And I started thinking, well, maybe I should do it. But then started asking the questions of, does it have value to society? If we were going to de-extinct something, what should be the highest priority, and what are those reasons? And that was a really interesting journey for me. And so that conversation, where many of my colleagues would have said, it's premature to be talking about that. It's probably, a lot of people are going to not like the idea at first or ever. And it turned out it was a fairly charismatic topic.
Charismatic topic.
Yeah.
We actually have a question right away, so I don't want to
We do. We have
Yes.
a question from Twitter, which is, are some scientists too accessible to the media, and what is their motivation to be so?
So,
I think it's Amy's turn.
are you, well, yeah, Amy was just saved by the question. So are you too easy?
Well, you know, I think it's important to communicate, and we don't get that many opportunities. And if scientists complain that that the average person doesn't understand what they're doing, doesn't fund what they're doing, doesn't, makes tactical, strategic errors, politicians and so forth, they've got no complaints if they haven't tried.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
And
I don't think you can be too. I think you can be too, circus-like. You can be too flamboyant where there's no substance. But I don't think you can be too communicative. I mean, as long as you. I mean, it doesn't take that much
I'll jump
time,
in to
really.
defend. I want to defend George for a minute, since I kind of suggested or agreed with you that maybe he was too easy. I just want to say, like, if he was giving really facile responses, then I might say I might agree with that. But like I have this email chain. I'm not going to read it, but I have like
Oh,
this
now
long,
you're going to chicken out.
this long
I see.
email chain with him
Yeah.
for which I asked him a lot of questions about a story that I wrote about gene editing of animals, and it didn't even really have to do with CRISPR yet. It was more about talents, but it was somewhat to do with CRISPR, and I really needed to wrap my head around CRISPR. And he answered all these like arcane, sort of about what the mutation rate is, what are off-target effects, and how do they relate to regular mutation rate. These sort of really technical questions, and he also answered a question about whether, which came from my daughter reading over my shoulder, and she was like, "Why are you writing about these boring animals? When are pigs going to fly? Like, are they really going
Right.
to make pigs fly, or what? Like, what are they going to? Or when can actually? She didn't even really care about pigs. She cared about human flight."
Yeah.
And he answered. So I just think
yeah,
that
yeah.
it is nice to have somebody who will.
You should understand, you may not know this, a question is a way a journalist gets a good answer.
I,
And George is giving very good answers. So now it's your turn. So in the same way, it seems to me that our distinguished colleague here, Dr. Church, uses the stuff of his science, the stuff of his research, to create demonstration projects, if you like, that will attract our attention. It seems to me that as a journalist, you have your version of the same franchise going. You are, I think, easily in daily journalism unique in that you have been able to sort of command the patience of your editors to allow you to do these remarkable and quite wonderful, I cannot compliment you highly enough, on the grace of your writing and the perception of your thinking and the depth of your reporting. But they are these sort of almost parables. And we've talked about this. They're very cleverly conceived, wonderfully written human dramas of connectomics, in which a heartbreaking young woman decides to have her head cut off and preserved on the off chance that science may one day be able to resurrect her. Or, through in your stories on autism, coming of age, looking at a syndrome or a condition, a spectrum disorder that interferes with your ability to sense the emotions of other people, looking at that through the struggles of two young lovers who are both on the autism spectrum, Asperger's syndrome. I mean, these are sort of perfect lenses, and they purport to be wonderful human narratives. But in fact, they're arguments about the technology that you're writing. They're arguments about the ups and downs of GMOs. They're arguments about connectomics. They're arguments about the place of autism in the range of normal human behavior. So you pulling a fast one? Do you think your readers know you're doing that, or do they take you at face value? Because they're crying when they read some of these things. They're beautiful.
It's such an interesting question. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I don't think that I command the patience of my editors. I would say that I test the patience of my editors. I mean, these things take long time to do, and part of the reason that it longer than they would like, and the reason is partly what you're saying. I think. I mean, and in a way, I mean, I do think that I sort of report out sort of two levels of a story. You know, one is sort of what is the argument if you were going to make it. So I actually have to say, also just to break the fourth wall here, that a subject of one of my stories has come in.
Oh, I love it.
Katie Moser, who I wrote about in 2007.
Welcome.
Katie, who I knew when she was 23, was one of the rare people who was at risk for having Huntington's disease. Gene mutation, and decided to get the test and found out that she did in fact have it. And she saw that I posted on Facebook that I was going to be here tonight, and she came, so I'm happy to see her. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about Katie's story. But I mean, I was interested then in all of these DNA tests that were becoming available. The Huntington's test had actually been available for a while, but sort of the first fruits of the Human Genome Project to kind of filter out of laboratories and into the real lives of regular people were this ability to get your DNA tested for various things, find out your risk of, for certain people, certain kinds of breast cancers or other kinds of cancers, for ancestry. And I wanted to sort of say to people, and so in terms of your point, like, well, what, is there an argument there? I mean, I wanted to talk about the risks and the sort of the personal dilemmas involved with having this information, or the ability to get this information. Like, should we just take it? Did we want it? What were the ramifications for families? And so you could have written a story, and many people did, and I like these kinds of stories, which sort of just talk to ethical, bioethicists and scientists and people about it and quote them. But I wanted to tell it a different way, and I think that and that's why I ended up following Katie for a ridiculously long time. During which point, at one point, Katie said to me, "You're not really working for the New York Times, are you?" Like, you're just hanging out with me, right? Because I wanted to see what her life was like after this test, and what she would, what would become of her, and what would, and so, and to me, that was just a more compelling way to tell that story. So your point is like, well, what are you, why are you doing it? I mean, I just want people to read the story, and I felt like people were more likely to read that kind of story.
That's an interesting point. And I asked the question because I see a pattern in a very successful pattern in how you craft these narratives. I mean, it's the nature of a long-form narrative that you need a human story, and human stories tend to, by and large, have happy endings or sad endings, and it's the nature of narrative nonfiction to have to simplify an argument to strengthen its human drama, and some things may lend themselves to that, like perhaps the story about Huntington's, but others may be more complicated and may or may not, you may lose dimensions when you storify it.
Yes, right. So okay, so you're sort of saying, well, am I manipulating people by telling them a story that, and I mean, I guess I would say.
That's a good way to put it.
I'm aware of that, potential, and I feel like I do the reporting to make sure that I'm not being manipulative in a bad way. Like, I do, like, the reporting is there so that I feel like I'm. So is there an argument? Like, I mean, the maybe the most controversial of my stories in regard to this, and also, just because of its general subject matter, I did 2 narrative stories on genetically modified food, right? And so, and the argument in those stories, both of them pretty much, but was
one just for the benefit. One was about an effort to get approval to field test an orange
Right,
that had
so-
been engineered to have, as best one could tell, wholly beneficial effects. And then the other,
The other was about an effort to, on the Big Island of Hawaii, to ban the cultivation of all genetically modified crops. And I sort of basically profiled the journey of one of the people on the council, on the county council, who was going to vote on this ban. And the ban passed, but he was one of these politicians who was genuinely undecided and went through kind of a journey of learning about, what the popular perceptions. He had all these people, his constituents, saying, we want you to ban GMOs. GMOs are evil and scary, and learning about whether that was true or not. So, the argument in that story was really about empiricism as a way to make decisions about policies in the world.
a very controversial stance these days.
So, I mean, to the extent that, so I feel like the idea that I was manipulative in promoting that value is not, I mean, it's like saying, that any other reporter would be manipulative in writing about human rights abuses, or, I mean, there are things that or that you believe in democracy, so you write about corruption, political corruption, or you believe in, the rule of law, so you write about corporations breaking the law. I mean, I think that, and I'm not even, I mean, I think this is true of science writing in general, right? What is the point of it? I mean, the point of it is to provide people with informed, with evidence of which they can make important decisions about their lives. And so, I felt like I was just doing my job.
Do you think, George, that we're doing that?
Amy is. I think there's a lot of it. I think that journalists tend to be more evidence-based than a lot of politicians. But that's, they should be reading the evidence. But there is a certain, it requires a lot of discipline, to go beyond the meaningless statistics to what's behind them, going beyond the press releases. And one way to do that is to follow a narrative. Scientists might reject this as anecdotalism, right? But if it's combined with a thorough research of all the science in parallel, I think that's very justified. I mean, without a narrative, the average person can't relate to it. It draws them in, but you need to make them want to have evidence-based legislation and evidence-based business decisions and so on. It's very important from my biased view.
That certainly is, I guess, what you would like.
I would love that if people made evidence-based decisions.
And what do you want?
I also want that.
You want that?
Yes, I do.
You have a question?
We do. We have a Twitter question. How can journalists ask the right questions without doing scientific research themselves? How do they get the info that they need?
Amy, why don't you start that, and then George, I'd like you to try to answer it too. So what should science journalists be doing to get their information if they're not doing scientific research of their own?
Do journalistic research. I mean, that's what journalists do. I mean, we will, and to some extent, we really rely on scientists to talk to us. But so, call up the experts in the field, read their stuff, call up their competitors.
Let me be a little bit more empirical here, if I may. So, let's pick one of your long-form narratives. Let's pick the wonderful stories on autism.
Okay.
7,300 words, the one, I forget what the other one was. What did you do? What was your research for that long and moving narrative?
Okay. I talked to a lot of autism researchers.
Okay, now a lot. Is that like more than 10 or more than 20?
I would say 10, 12, probably more, maybe
12.
maybe more.
Okay.
Maybe, I mean, I'm thinking, this is a while ago, so Not sure
I
I can
appreciate
come
it.
up with all the names of the people that I talked to, but yeah, and read papers. I mean, what was, but so none of whom were quoted in the story. Also, I feel, because that's kind of what I meant about. I mean, now we're back to just talking about the narrative thing, but I mean that's what I meant about like reporting 2 layers of the story. So I felt like I had to make sure that I knew what I was talking about. So part of it was about, part of that research was about, well, there's this spike, quote, epidemic of autism, what accounted for the rise in numbers of diagnosis, because part of the premise of that story, so now I'm talking about the story where I followed a young man, Justin Kanya, who was in his final years of high school, and so he, there's an education law which mandates that there's certain supports that are available for individuals on the spectrum through high school, and they get 2 extra years of high school, and then kind of that's it. And part of the point the reason I wrote that story then was that the largest generation that had been diagnosed as children were coming of age and were reaching that point, and so what was going to happen to them. And the other type of research that I did for that wasn't so much scientific, but it was, it was about, what is the best case scenario? Like, what can we do for people in that situation in terms of their education and during those last years? And so I talked to a lot of educators also for that story, also none of whom I quoted, but about, so there is like evidence-based outcome. There's research on what happens to kids who are sort of during those final years, like in a basement filling out math worksheets versus being taken into a community. And so what happened with Justin was he had this very enlightened situation, and people ask me, well, why did you choose this kind of like this kid from sort of an affluent family in this really good school? And part of the reason I did was because I wanted to make the point that this is the best, if someone like him can succeed with the best case scenario, that where research shows this is the best case scenario, then there is hope that others can, and we should try to apply that more broadly. And so so he was in this situation where he was doing community-based education, essentially, like being taken out to learn how to take a bus and work in different environments in the community. The community was introduced to him. The teacher was facilitating these kind of different bridges so that when he graduated, he could have some degree of independence. And he did get some degree of independence. Not like he didn't get. He was an artist. His special skill was art, and his dream was to like work at Pixar or Disney, and he didn't. But he got a bakery job, which was great.
Right.
Okay.
So your research was.
So my research was.
You did a lot of backgrounding.
Yes. And
12
then,
people, 20 people. People
in
like
terms
George.
Of like, yeah, in terms
on
of
whose generosity you
Yes.
depend.
All those autism experts, education experts, and then also I interviewed a bunch of like different. I wasn't sure. Then there's like the narrative, like who are you going to tell that story through? So I talked to maybe a dozen families in different situations, and a different, like all these factors contribute. But Justin's family was very open to me doing it and cooperative, and Justin was a really interesting.
Right. And in the end, you have to go through this process where you basically, this research informs you, informs the writing of your story, but those people don't actually appear in the story necessarily, and their expertise may not be visible. I mean, so what I would wonder, George, is someone who is, as we were kind of saying earlier, remarkably generous. I can't think of a man who is got to be busier than you, and you're here, like, does it irritate you as a busy scientist who is interested in reaching the public that you'll spend however much time on the phone or emails with people like me or people like Amy, uplifting the general level of, the background level of ignorance of American journalism, but you yourself actually don't ever show up in the story. I mean, your fingerprints may be there, but you are not. Is that off-putting?
I imagine it is for some people. I don't feel like it is for me. I mean, I'm happy to go. I never go off the record. So I don't expect that I'm not asking to, but if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. You know, if they use the ideas without using a quote, or even use a quote without acknowledgement, that's okay with me. But I agree with you, it's not necessarily okay with everybody if they put a lot of effort into it. Most of them don't put a lot of effort into it, so maybe it's okay with them. I don't know. I haven't, but most of my conversations are with people who won't talk at all. So they, yeah, so that's that. I think one of the challenges, back to the question, with doing journalistic research is you typically, the easiest way for maybe a slightly more conventional but still valuable story, more conventional than Amy might do, is the first thing you want to do is find the extremes. You want to find whoever just did a press release, and then whoever thinks it's a bunch of baloney, okay, that they didn't really discover anything important, or when in fact we have a dearth of stories that make it over the limit. You don't really need somebody to tear it down, but still that helps you do your research, because then you know who to ask in between, or you know what to go off and question. You go back to the originators of the press release and say, you know, either identify your source or not, says that you didn't actually do this, or it was done 10 years ago, or they did a better job, or you know, whatever. And then you essentially act as a middle person between the two views, and that's a way of doing research. And they each will give you a bunch of articles to read, or you know, hopefully readable ones, and then you can do a little research there too. So I think that's a very common way of doing it. But sometimes it's hard because there is no counterpoint. Everybody agrees on it. And to get the counterpoint, you have to go to the fringe. You know, there was some comedy skit, I can't remember what it was, where they brought in a proportional number of experts on global warming, and then it was like 99 global warming experts, and one nutcase who represented the alternative. Not that I mean, this is the way they presented it. I'm not saying that global warming is absolutely proven beyond a shadow of doubt. And that was their way of saying that would be a fair discussion. And the way it's usually put is you'll get one pro and one con, no matter what the actual consensus levels are in the scientific field. And that's another challenge. I mean, I think it's solvable, but it's a challenge, is to find that counterpoint without giving undue weight to what might be a fringe element.
So we have a question here, but I would just want to finish this thread. So given what the two of you are saying here, I wonder if you feel that in some ways in our journalistically and scientifically, in our public conversation about genetics, about in its various ramifications and forms, genetically modified organisms, embryo editing, whatever, that we're kind of stuck in a loop. I mean, that the same kinds of questions and the same kinds of debates kind of run in a circle.
That's certainly how it feels.
Are we trapped? Are we not listening? Or are the
like
questions so fundamental?
It's a spiral.
That
every
they
time
don't
you
go away.
inject a new fact or a new discovery, it goes to another place. But yeah, there is a certain amount of redoing the arguments rather than going to the next level. You know, you could just say, hey, read that previous article, and we're going to start there. But it's hard to do that because it's not fair to your father and your daughter, who may not have read all those previous articles. And so you have to start from scratch to some extent. But there's a lot of that from my perspective, is I feel like we start over. Groundhog Day. Yeah.
Well, no, exactly. There is a Groundhog Day quality to some of these public debates, conversations,
but it's
food
necessary.
fights.
Yeah, I mean, I think with GMOs, I kind of felt like, okay, like now I've explored every, objection, every issue, and so now everybody is going to, just read my stories, like, but.
Start there.
But the debates the same debates do still occur. So I don't know. I think with GMOs, there's been a slight change, I think, but maybe it's just because it's when I started paying attention to it. But I think that there is some more awareness of sort of what's, that they're not. But I don't have enough. I don't have like the polling evidence, so I'm not even going to say that. It's just, I
No,
don't
but
know-
I think
don't
it's
know how
a
to
good
gauge
example in
it.
that there is, I think if you're locked in an argument about, I don't know, gene editing and embryo research, and you're writing a story about it, there is not this expectation, which there is, say, for instance, with genetically modified foods, that every story ought to recapitulate the entire history of the debate.
Right.
And that anything that's left out or over summarized is evidence of a fast one being pulled.
Yeah, it spirals, it changes when when the facts change. So for example, prior to in vitro fertilization, there were all these scare tactics about test tube babies were going to be teratogenic and monstrous and in pain. And then the fact was injected that Louise Brown was actually adorable and happy. And then
And healthy.
that kind of changed the discussion for a while. And the same thing happens with, with CRISPR. You have this adorable little girl that got cured of leukemia via CRISPR modification of the T cells coming in, TALEN modification, gene editing, and it depends on these stories that bubble up from time to time. In the case of embryo manipulation, beyond in vitro fertilization, there's now this mitochondrial cure, which for some reason or other, it should change the conversation completely because it is germline editing of a chromosome, the mitochondrial chromosome, but suddenly that's put off in a separate category. Well, that's no longer germline, even though it is. So there's an effort to bring us back to the circle, even though we could spiral up a notch.
So there's kind of a gravitational effect of a
You wanna
particular.
go back to where you're comfortable.
Yeah. So we have a question here.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for organizing
Yeah,
this.
and I appreciate your patience.
No problem. Two very quick questions. One is, can you imagine, say, the NIH or the NSF putting a large sum of money towards the ethical, legal, and social implications of CRISPR-Cas9 as they did for the Human Genome Project? And if the answer is yes or maybe, I'm envisaging the kind of stuff that David Baltimore just did at the National Academies on this issue, and they gave you, say, $500 million to both of you to do something. What would you want that to be used for? Would you be interested more in kind of a debate about, bacteriophages attacking bacteria, or more of the social issues of, people always will talk about eugenics, they'll talk about accessibility, or even, less obvious but equally interesting questions of intellectual property battles that will probably be going on between those players of CRISPR.
So if NIH or NSF gave us $1 billion, was it? To look at ethical, social, and legal implications of CRISPR-Cas9, what would you do with it?
Well, just briefly interject a fact.
Yeah, please.
Having the Genome Project, they set aside about 1% of the $3 billion for ethics, which was a gigantic amount for ethics, but it was nowhere near the amount we just talked about.
We can only dream.
What was done with that? That was sort of before I
Well, it was a very interesting
go ahead.
story in a way, because one of the proponents of the Genome Project, who went directly to Congress, and you can guess who I'm talking about, was quoted as saying that this was a way of shutting them up by putting gold in their mouth. So that was one strategy. We tested their real intentions at one point, inadvertently, I guess. Seems like a lot of these things I back into, by putting into one of our large, heavily scientific and technical projects an ELSI component, ethical, legal, and social component. And they approved the whole grant, and they apparently just thought that was just filler that we had put in. And then when I said, okay, I'm ready to do it, they said, oh no, you can't do that. And I said, well, you approved my grant. And they said, well, the ELSI was supposed to be done by ELSI experts. There's not supposed to be a crossover between ELSI. They're not supposed to be actually talking to the research scientists that are making transformative technologies. And I said, that seems like exactly what you should be doing. And so anyway, we ended up had to fund it on our own, privately, even though it had been part of a $10 million grant. And that was the origin of the Personal Genome Project.
I see,
It wasn't
I
a
see.
stunt. We put it in the grant, and we had to go out and get private funding for it.
Yeah.
So most scientists would have not wanted even to do it, much less have to do it above the objection of Francis Collins. But we went ahead and did it, and it's still alive 10 years later. And it's
Well, yes,
international now.
and it's fair to say that the 1% or 3% or whatever it was that was earmarked
Yeah.
under Watson's, I
Yeah.
guess, tutelage
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
early Human Genome Project,
Yeah.
actually set a kind of precedent,
Yeah.
which in many ways, you're a good example of it, is now kind of more or less routinely observed in a lot of projects. That is partly that scientists like yourself ought to be looking at these things, that it is a necessary component of the research that you do. What would you do with $1 billion?
I wouldn't be ethically able to take that money. So
You
I-
are
but,
the best.
But I,
Yeah.
would like, I
Yeah.
mean, I think you mentioned, the person who
Yeah.
asked the question mentioned the intellectual property issues. I mean, I do think that George could maybe speak to this, but just one of the most interesting issues to me about what's happening with CRISPR is the patent dispute, and sort of why are we even having this patent dispute,
Right.
and why isn't what kind of, didn't we pay for this research? Didn't the public pay for this research? And so why, who's getting rich off of it, and
Yeah,
what should go?
yeah.
So I think exploring that would be. I mean, I'm interested.
It may be the case, and then we have another question, that in fact the social, ethical, and legal conundrums of CRISPR-Cas9 are in fact really not much different from the social, legal, and ethical ramifications of the original Human Genome Project. In fact, that the
I
questions
think
are
they're
the same.
much
You
much
think,
more significant.
you think
yeah.
they're much more significant?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I think that there's a limit to how much damage you can do with knowledge of yourself, especially if there's education that accompanies it. So in other words, you could create an ethical problem if you dumped a bunch of data on people without any education. But that was a smooth transition. While on the other hand, when you start altering the world, altering human nature, altering wild populations of mosquitoes to get rid of malaria, you have things that where education is not sufficient. I mean, it's part of it, but it's really not sufficient. And you can do permanent damage. If I tell you that you have a risk of cancer, you're not going to go out and just whip out your scalpel and take it out, right? You're going to talk to probably get at least one medical opinion, right? While if you enable the public to take out, mosquitoes, they might do it just as democratically as they got rid of GMOs in Hawaii. They would take a vote and say, hey, I don't like mosquitoes, and boom, they're gone, right? And the problem is, it's not a local event. Like, if you get upset because you're at risk for cancer, that's a very local event, affects maybe your family. But if you eliminate mosquitoes, it's a global event. Anyway, I think the stakes are much higher.
Be turned off, right? You said gene drive could be turned off.
Well,
Well-
we're working on it, but that's the point. That was an ethical issue
Yeah.
with a
No,
possibly technical
bring
answer.
our audience into this.
Yeah,
Bring
yeah,
our
right,
audience
right.
into this.
You-
So one of your concerns that she's raising is that, well, these very powerful gene editing techniques can kind of race through an entire population.
Right.
And you and people like you are trying to figure out how to design kill switches. Yeah, essentially.
Or reversibility. I think
Reversibility.
all technologies,
And then I really want,
yeah.
Dan's being very
should-
patient.
should-
No,
yeah,
come on.
should be. I mean, you need to have some idea of how to contain them, not just physically, but every way you can, and to study them and to reverse them. And that wasn't necessarily going to be part of the discussion. There was no funding for that. In fact, we had examples where the gain-of-function flu went public without really, it got to a very advanced stage before there was any discussion at all. We tried to take gene drives to the discussion stage before we did experiments, which was different from the usual
So
thing.
from where you
But
standpoint.
the injection of LC money,
Yeah.
just like in the
Yeah.
Genome Project, would help get these discussions happening earlier rather than at the 11th hour when it's too late. Everybody knows about it.
Or we've already made the mistake.
Or, yeah,
So from
exactly.
your standpoint, one of your motivations, perhaps as a science communicator,
Yeah.
this is your way of inoculating the general population against
Yeah.
overreach? What? Just why you're doing this?
It is a big motivation is that we don't mess up, that the science isn't run by the people who are in the biggest rush. It's run by people who can quickly get public discussion and, maybe in some cases moratoria, in other cases regulation, but to start setting higher standards for all of us.
I mean,
Hey,
I would say we could
okay,
use
thank
the
you.
LC money to fund investigative reporting into sort of the scientific enterprise as a whole. I mean, that is something that I think, just making sure that like, what is getting funded and why and who and I mean, I think that my interest, as you've so nicely outlined it, has mostly been so far to look at kind of the interface of science and like how it affects people's sort of personal lives. But I think that there is now really more of an imperative for science journalists to be kind of holding scientists accountable. And so I'm interested more in like this whole sociology of science and what are they doing? And why aren't there more women? Also.
Well, why aren't there more women? But we'll talk about that if you'd like. But what I'd like to, just to close out this thread is, so for George, education is a big chunk of why he's doing this.
Dialogue, both ways. Yeah.
Well, dialogue is tricky, as we often see. I mean, you can have a dialogue and get nowhere.
But it's better than not trying.
It's better than not trying.
Yeah.
Is that your motivation? Are you an educator? Are you a public educator? Are you trying to head us off from making some egregious mistake with this emerging technology?
Maybe. I mean, that's
Cutting our
part-
heads off and freezing them and hoping that they'll be able to resurrect our minds a generation from now? Or, I mean, is that a cautionary tale or is it just a tale?
It's I want people to have the information, all the information they need to make. It's sort of the same thing. I mean, just to make rational decisions about, whether to fund this science with our, with our tax dollars, and also, and what to do with it. So yeah. I mean, a lot of it is education, but making sure that, what's there to be told is really told. That you can shine a light on, what they want to tell us and what they don't want to tell us. So, yeah, there's education.
So you've been very patient?
Yeah, so thank you guys for coming. So kind of related to that, actually, as of now, we're at this place where you can sort of debate the scientific consensus, and in the especially with the climate change skeptics and the GMO versus non-GMO debate. And then in the meantime, you go online and you have blogs that look just as reputable to some who might not be media savvy as the New York Times webpage does, for example. So how do we, moving forward, especially in kind of the age of the web and everybody has an opinion and is shouting it into the internet, do we make sure that that science prevails or that the truth prevails? Does that make sense?
Do you think those are the same thing?
Do I think that science and truth are the same thing? No, I don't think science and
Just
truth are the
checking,
same
just
thing. Of course
checking.
not. I'm here. But no, I just want to know, how do we make sure that I guess facts prevail over misinformation and, people like the skeptics and the deniers?
Amy? What do you do in this everybody gets their own set of facts environment to persuade?
I mean, I worry about it a lot, partly because I use this app called Nuzzle.
Nuzzle?
Yes. I sort of recommend it and I sort of don't for this very reason, because it has already put like such a, already there were blinders. I choose who I follow on Twitter, and so I only see their Twitter. But Nuzzle actually like links me to just is like a compilation of the links of everybody that I follow on Twitter. So now I don't even have to worry about my Twitter feed. I just read. So I see like what I see is what what the scientists and science journalists who I mostly follow are tweeting about. And that worries me. I mean, I'm not giving you an answer so much as saying like it is a concern that everyone kind of already. It's like even if I write the best, most persuasive, correct, righteous story, like I don't know. I mean, it's nice to work for the New York Times in this era, I will say, because there's still that sense that it reaches beyond some of those that whatever what people still look at it for now.
They do.
But
I mean, if I'm hearing you, so the New York Times itself, and I'm not picking on the New York Times, but to follow your thought, is itself a bubble that we, many of us, live inside?
Right.
I mean, we tend to sort of maybe see your bubble as a problem, but are we as science journalists and science sources? I mean, have we isolated ourselves?
I mean, that's why I write for my father and my daughter, though, because I had this experience recently where I had this story about the effort to do a new assembly of the Aedes aegypti mosquito genome, which is the mosquito that carries Zika, and all these scientists on Twitter responded, and they were like really picking at like, oh, my terminology, like should I have called it a DNA map? Well, there's a different meaning of a map in genomics, and so and I was like, you guys, come on, like we need to reach a broader audience than but it is interesting that it could be so narrow cast that the people that really responded to that were the genomicists, but I was at least happy that the mosquito genome was on the front page.
It was a remarkable journalistic moment. Let's talk about please.
I guess my response to this worrying about people making up their own facts or living in their own echo chamber is that somebody has to go cross over into that other bubble, and I actually enjoy doing this. What I do is I look for my most severe critics, and I'm not upset. I'm delighted actually, and I'll go and I'll talk to them. I'll exchange email, talk to them on the phone. Sometimes if I'm in town, I'll talk to them face to face. And these include creationists at one end, various denialists, anti-GM folks, and I have very pleasant conversations. And in a few of those communities, I'm now quoted as their best friend, just because I listened to them, just because I had a conversation. I don't think either of us really convinced the other one, but there was a little bit of dialogue going on there, and I think that's what we need to do. Is we need to bridge these. We don't necessarily have to address every single blog, but we can get a representative one when one seems particularly germane or particularly extreme. And I think that's we need to do more of that.
And then I'll just use it as a way to plug the narrative shtick also, because I do think
the
that
narrative shtick? Okay.
I do think that narrative, like stories, are more likely to reach beyond the bubble than kind of argumentation. I mean, I don't have evidence for that, but I do think that people are just more likely to read a story that is a tale than is like clearly delineated as, you're just explaining something to me that I already know I don't agree with, so I'm going to dismiss it.
No, I mean, just for the sake of discussion, I agree with you, which is why it's interesting to put how you then construct that narrative and how you freight it under a magnifying lens.
Appreciate that.
So, here, thank you.
So it seems to me that life sciences in general and genetics in particular is an area where trust between the public and scientists and science journalists, sort of in that triangle, is really important. Could you talk a little bit about how you each see that relationship and what each of you thinks your field can do to help build a little trust in all those communities?
The iron triangle of trust. Interesting question. George, do you trust any of this?
Any of genetics?
No, I mean,
of-
maybe we trust you, but do you trust us?
Yeah, actually, I've had, I think that occasionally someone will come, a journalist will come to me with a script that they've already written for me, and I will be stereotyped. I think by now, if they've done any research on me at all, I've escaped most of the stereotypes. Maybe the stereotype is the loose cannon stereotype. They don't know where I'm going to go. But you know, sometimes they say, I'm looking for someone who will be an ardent advocate for this really dangerous science, you know, and that's what they want. And they expect me to be that person. So that undermines my trust a little bit. But usually by the end of the conversation, you know, one of the problems with some of my colleagues who are sort of intermediate between the ones who won't talk at all and me is that they try to rush it. They'll say, okay, you got 2 minutes, you know, and here's my spiel, and you know, just take my fire hose, and then that's it. And that doesn't always result in the ideal outcome. And then they go into this first category, I'm never going to talk to them again. And that's another way that trust gets undermined, and it's because not enough time has been set. It's not a huge amount of time. It's just, for some people, they just are so, their time is so precious in some kind of pound foolish way that they don't give a chance for trust to develop. So these are scientists I'm talking about.
Let me ask you, how much do you trust your readers?
I mean,
To go with you, to believe the story that you've put together for them?
well, that's my challenge, it's not so much my trust in them to do that, as like how, if I do it well, then they will follow me. I mean, if they sense, I think that readers can definitely sense when you don't really have the authority to be telling your story. And that's why I take so friggin' long to write these stories, is because I feel like I have to be authoritative in order to win that trust and to deserve that trust. And so you know, and that's why I really test the patience of my editors to do it, because I think that otherwise it fails, and it's such a gamble. I mean, it's such a risk, because you know, when you put something, as you say, like it's almost like writing a parable, when you're trying to make an argument through a story, and you don't have the right story, or you know, you don't have the right argument, then you know, it's it's just so much. It's a huge flop. It's not just like, oh, this was a boring story. I stopped reading in the middle. It's like a breach of faith. It's just like it's really bad.
So you obviously have a huge following. There are many people who know your work, and if they see your byline, will immediately go to it. But of course, there are people, couple, who don't know your work, and they're coming to you for the first time. And so, you know, for George, in a way, the trust is an act of patience. He's willing to talk to people that maybe he doesn't really think that it's going to do any good, but he's a patient, trusting person. What do you do? Do you have like techniques to win a reader's trust?
I mean, I do really like also engaging with my critics, like after. I mean, even, you know, so on the Zika story, so I mean, they weren't really that critical, but you know, the scientists who were saying, well, maybe you should, you know, do we really need to resequence the mosquito genome? You know, we can learn things about it from just the current assembly, or you know, this was getting really kind of technical. But I tried to answer all of those tweets and all of those questions, just because it and it has led me to new story ideas, so it's always sort of worth it actually in the end. I mean, I think that just trying to engage, and Twitter, you know, has been a really great forum for that, because people reach out to you even, you know, much more than through email, and they have no hesitation to, you know, tweet their responses there, and they're not all positive, and I try to, and I like, even though it's somewhat stressful, because that argument, it used to be like readers would email me and I would try to respond to all of my email, but now it's happening in public, and so everyone can jump in and pile on, but that's okay. I mean, I like it.
I want to talk about piling on actually with both of you in a minute, but I want to take a couple of questions here. So,
Yeah, so Amy Harmon recently had a story about sexual harassment and possibly sexual assault by a biology professor at Chicago. And one of the things that really struck me about what happened after that was that it generated a lot of conversation among scientists. I think it had a really big impact on the scientists who read the story. So I'm curious if you think there is a bigger role for science writers and science journalists to kind of moderate and shepherd discussion in general within the scientific community, or if it's more of a one-way science to the public reporting thing.
Wait, I just want to ask you for clarification. You mean, what do you mean to shepherd discussion among the scientists? Like,
So I guess in that particular case, I saw that a lot of the points brought up, so I'm a biologist, I saw that a lot of the points brought up in your article were actually, I think, starting points for conversations. And I think that you discussed before a little bit about biology and science ethics, and I'm curious to what degree you think that it's sort of reporting on, your job is reporting on the ethics and what scientists are discussing, and to what degree there's feedback. To what degree scientists should, or science writers can get scientists to actually rethink their positions or rethink the state of what they're doing based on your reporting.
right. Well, I mean, yeah, and that's sort of what I was talking about a little bit earlier, that I think that I'm more and more interested in trying to sort of hold scientists accountable for the integrity of the scientific enterprise that is affecting all of us, and that we pay a lot of money for it, and you want it to be fair and equitable and equal and democratic, and it's not. I mean, I could say, yeah. So yeah, I was gratified that it did seem to spark some discussion. There was a lot of discussion actually about when is it okay for a PI to sleep with their graduate students, and or and there was a divisive. It wasn't entirely clear what people thought about that. A lot of people thought it was not okay, just for the record. But so yeah, I do think it's a big part of what science journalists should be doing. Not so much, I guess I would say, I did get a lot, and I'm certainly not the only one. Actually, Michael Balter is here, who wrote an amazing story about sexual harassment at the American Museum of Natural History. And I'll just say, there are others who've written about this, and I think that one thing that happened to me after is that a lot of scientists wrote to me and said, "Oh, you should look into so and so." Something. This guy is moving here right now. You really should investigate before something else bad happens. And so I don't think that it's the role of journalists to be like the police people for scientists. Like you have to get your act together. So, but to the degree that we can shine a light on something that's wrong and that would like motivate some action, that would be nice.
Do you have a thought about that, George?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the proliferation of journalism that we were concerned about a moment ago could actually be beneficial. Amy shouldn't have to do this more than once, but maybe lots of people are shining little lights on little problems that are reflective of the big problem that was brought up. I think that could be quite valuable. Of course, you get into the problem of false positives, where there's slander occurring where someone hasn't done it. But the hope is that there will be facts on the ground. But it can turn into bullying, is what can happen when it gets into people who are less concerned about checking the facts before they go to press.
Another question here?
So first off, thank you for joining us today. Since CRISPR was a topic, I thought I'd just cut to the chase and ask this. Do either of you think that human gene editing is completely and absolutely unethical? Why or why not? And how should we go about addressing this? both on as a scientific community and in the public.
You mean the human embryo or human, or just, I'll just go with human gene editing. Okay.
Well, human gene editing, I think, that's already done. I mean,
Right.
there's 2,000 clinical trials on gene therapy, which includes gene editing. So I think in adults, that probably is not going to be examined unless there's a safety issue, unless somebody. And I think the more controversial issue is whether you can affect subsequent generations without their consent. A lot of gene therapy is done on children before the age of consent, but it isn't done on grandchildren. I mean, unborn children.
Right.
And even though unborn children have exactly the same amount of consent as born
Right.
children, which is 0.
Yeah.
They're both 0.
Yeah.
So it is kind of this strange exceptionalism. And most medical decisions, you've hit a button on the. I think I'm one of the few people in my field who's actually willing to weigh in on this subject. Not advocating a particular position, but willing to come up with scenarios where germline would be medically advantageous, and that would. But the point is, usually when you decide on make a medical decision about a new therapy or medical device, the decision is based on safety and efficacy. It's not based on method. You don't say, all sharp things should not be used in medicine because somebody got a HIV needle prick or somebody, scalpel cut a surgeon through the glove. You just implement safety procedures and regulations, and you deal with the benefits outweighing the risks. We still get needle pricks, even with the butterfly phlebotomy, and we still get occasional scalpel problems. But you don't do it by category, you do it by safety and efficacy, and that's how the FDA works and so forth. So it's kind of strange. So let me paint one specific scenario that I think hasn't been discussed much in literature, and there's a lot of armchair philosophers on the subject of germline. It's like psychology. Everybody thinks they're an expert on the subject. But if you have two parents that have Tay-Sachs, which is or a variety of very deleterious, serious medical genetics, and they want to have their own child rather than somebody else's, it is medical ethics practice to do what you can to help them have their own child, and typically it's done via termination of pregnancy.
Sure. Yeah.
And 75% of the children will be fine. But about half of our country doesn't want to make that decision of termination. In fact, they don't want any of us to make that decision. And so if you presented them with a way of altering the sperm of the father that is a Tay-Sachs carrier or some other disease, now no embryos are at risk. No one needs to get an abortion for that reason. There are plenty of other reasons. And that could be a win-win. But not if you draw the line at germline gene therapy. Only if you draw the line at safety, efficacy, and accommodation of the psychology and religion of people in the country.
I'll just bring up Katie, who's in the room, who is has the gene that will cause her to get Huntington's disease, and I have permission to talk about this, at least I think. So Katie went through a process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where she this was several years ago, but she decided that she was, wanted to have a child, and so I don't know if people know what that is, but you basically it's like in vitro it's in vitro fertilization. They create embryos in addition, then you look at the embryos and see which ones have the gene, and then you would implant the ones that don't have the gene. But all of her embryos had the gene. So, to me, I don't see why she shouldn't have been able to have that edited.
Right.
That edited.
Edited.
Okay,
those
so we
embryos.
got thumbs up and thumbs up.
If it goes
What's
in the same direction, so in other words, you're not introducing it's not like you're putting in ostrich DNA or something. You're going to a DNA variant which has been tested billions of times. You're going to what all of us have. And so that, as long as you're sure that's where you're going, and that's about safety and
Obviously,
efficacy
if
testing.
she wanted it, which we haven't
Yeah.
discussed.
But you've touched this. That's very powerful, very powerful. But you've touched on something, which is that so often the debates, the discussions, and the journalistic back and forth that we have about advanced biology, whether it's GMOs or gene drives or gene editing, is that the controversy is always about the technique and not about what we're doing with it. And that seems peculiar.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts as to why that might be? Is it just that as a journalistic matter, it's the novelty of the technique that drives the coverage?
It's easier to make decisions that way. So it's easier to see what your party says than to make a case-by-case decision. It's easier to brand an entire category as unsafe rather than actually do the safety testing. That's a guess at one of the set of the reasons.
Or the flip, it's easier to brand an entire category as safe without
If you can
bothering
get away
to do
with
the
that,
testing.
yeah.
Well, yeah. Well,
It's easier to say it's unsafe.
Well, in our culture, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yes, so in a lot of science topics, especially when we're talking about GMOs and genetic engineering, there is a sort of complete integration in the public eye between the science and the politics. And that on its own is somewhat inevitable, but what happens, I think, is that people will sometimes feel that they need to support or believe in a certain outcome because it fits with their political alignment. How do you cut through this? I mean, if you even think it's happening and if you think you should.
I think sometimes there's a win-win waiting to be found, where you don't need to change your party allegiance, you don't need to convince anybody necessarily, is that you get a technological breakthrough. So for example, I was one of the few people working on embryonic stem cells during my PhD thesis and my postdoc. They were mouse embryonic stem cells. And then I jumped from that to years later working on adult-derived pluripotent stem cells, which are very similar. But I skipped over the human embryonic-derived stem cells, which caused all the furor. But when people found out that there was this alternative, suddenly it was a win-win. Now, some scientists still wanted to work on embryonic stem cells, but it greatly reduced the tensions because there was this alternative way of doing things. And you know, this comes up again and again, you know, like animal research, the conflict that sometimes when you can't think of an alternative, that people will balance an extreme view by going just as extreme in the opposite direction when they really, in their heart, they would prefer to be in the middle. But they'd figure if they're in the middle, then the balance will go to the other side. So with animal rights research, you can come up with things like we can now make human organs in the lab, which can be used for testing, which are actually better than animals for certain things. So the thing is to be on the lookout for the win-win scenarios and cover them, even before they're mature, so that you can have a discussion as to whether it really is a win-win or whether maybe it's just you know, self-promotion or wishful thinking or what have you. And often it will look like that at the beginning, but it's good to discuss it.
As a matter of coverage, do you have a thought?
I mean, I think that, you know, my job is just to keep writing about, is just to, I mean, in terms of coverage about like how to get people to come out of their rigid
Yeah, but I mean,
positions.
so, you know, George is, I think, offering the thought that, well, science can fix a lot of the moral conundrums that science has created.
Yeah.
As a matter of your sense of science journalism, is it our concern to be especially attentive to that?
Yeah.
Or should we leave the scientists to kind of worry about their own, you know, moral problems.
No, I mean, I think, I'm interested in how CRISPR will shift the debate about GMOs in agriculture, because a big concern of a lot of the critics has been, we're putting, DNA from another species into, we're combining foreign DNA, and so CRISPR, to some extent, will let you not do that. Will let you just sort of like tweak the DNA within the same organism. And so maybe this whole big debate is going to kind of lose a lot of the air. Or maybe it won't, because it's still manipulating DNA. So.
Well, I'd like to get one more question in, if I can.
Hi, I'm fascinated by DIY bio and sort of people dealing with biotechnology that are creative ways in their own garages, in their own labs, until I learned about CRISPR, in which case I got a little bit nervous. And as these genetic engineering tools become easier to use and more ubiquitous, we've talked a lot about trust and ethics. How is the public going to trust the scientists creating the technology that allows their neighbor to do wacky things with mosquitoes? And how do scientists or journalists encourage or enforce responsibility with these biological big guns?
I have to just say that that's not a hypothetical question. I just was looking at a Kickstarter campaign this afternoon. For $70 you can buy a CRISPR kit that you can use in your kitchen. Theoretically, I mean, I haven't tried to play with it yet. And while it does fairly elemental things, it's a fairly, as you would certainly know much better than me, a fairly elemental tool. So what's your response to that?
Well, I think that, a couple of things. One is that CRISPR is just one of a long line of things that you could do in your kitchen. Much more dangerous things you can do in your kitchen is to grow the stuff that grows on your hand, the staphylococcus, multi-drug-resistant staphylococcus. You can grow that with a Petri plate, which you can make from common kitchen tools, foods. That's quite dangerous. And if you do recombinant DNA on it, old-fashioned 1970s recombinant DNA on it, that's bad too. CRISPR so far isn't that dangerous, except it is one of the few things where you can get something novel to spread in the wild. And one of the reasons we wrote about CRISPR gene drives as a theoretical and a safety precautionary theme before we did any experiments was we were concerned that everybody has a species they don't like, and the union of all those species may be all the species, which would be, not good. And it's hard to police because there's no fingerprints on a gene drive. So one of the things that I did about a decade ago was proposed in a white paper that was widely distributed that there be surveillance. So part of the reason that people behave themselves on the roads is they have licenses that can be taken away based on surveillance for alcohol and speeding. And then during the ensuing 10 years there now is some surveillance. So that is to say that you can't just order DNA now. Back then, you could order DNA for smallpox and just say, send it to me. And the lawyers would say, don't look inside the order because then you become responsible for it. And so I had to overcome that attorney.
I don't mean to, but maybe I want to give you an opportunity before we close, if you want to weigh in on that. Should you be out there with the gene police writing tickets?
I'll just say that I'm also interested in DIY bio.
As a spectator or a participant? Yeah. Okay. Well, we are getting to the close of our time. I cannot imagine a better note to end on than that cryptic and provocative and evasive smile. What I want to say is that I can't thank you all enough for having come to join us, for having put up with our questions and our impertinence. I want to remind you all that we will have another session on April 20th and then again on May 4th. I invite you to join us, and I invite you now to close this conversation with applause and gratitude for our two fabulous guests.